The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Metropolitan General Hospital as a well-dressed woman stepped out of her silver SUV. She smoothed down her navy blazer and checked her reflection in the car window one last time. Her heart was beating a little faster than usual, not from nervousness, but from excitement about the plan she had crafted. As the new hospital director, she could have walked in with fanfare and formal introductions. Instead, she had convinced the board to let her spend a week observing the hospital operations undercover before officially starting her role. The best way to understand the heart of a hospital is to see it beating naturally, she had told them. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, welcoming her into the bustling lobby. The familiar hospital smell, a mixture of disinfectant and coffee, filled her nostrils. She had spent 20 years working her way up through various hospitals, starting as a nurse before moving into administration. But today, she was just another new face in the crowd. She had planned everything carefully. Her ID badge identified her as a temporary administrative assistant, allowing her to move freely through different departments without raising suspicion. Under her blazer, she wore a MAGA shirt, not as a political statement, but as part of her assessment of the hospital's true culture and how they handled different viewpoints. At the reception desk, a friendly older woman with gray-streaked hair looked up from her computer. "Good morning, honey. How can I help you?" The warmth in her voice was genuine, something the new director noted mentally. First impression, positive. "Hi, I'm starting today in administration," she replied, presenting her temporary ID. The receptionist, whose name tag read Betty, gave her quick directions to the administrative office on the third floor. As she walked toward the elevators, she observed everything. The worn but clean floors, the way staff members interacted with each other, the tone of conversations floating through the air. In the elevator, she shared space with two nurses discussing patient rounds and a maintenance worker with a toolbox. Their conversation didn't skip a beat as she entered, another good sign. Hospitals where staff felt comfortable talking openly usually had healthier work environments. The administrative floor was quieter than the lobby, but still hummed with activity. She found an empty desk in the general administrative area and settled in, arranging a few personal items she had brought to make her presence look natural. A family photo, a coffee mug, a small plant. Props that would help her blend in. Throughout the morning, she immersed herself in genuine administrative work while keenly observing the office dynamics. She noticed the cliques that formed during coffee breaks, heard the undertones in conversations about hospital policies, and watched how different departments interacted with administration. By lunchtime, she had already filled several pages in her mental notebook. The hospital had potential. She could see it in the dedication of the staff and the general efficiency of operations. But there were undercurrents too, whispered complaints about favoritism, subtle tensions between departments, and most interestingly, strong reactions to even the slightest hint of political discussion. As she prepared to head to the cafeteria for lunch, she deliberately removed her blazer, knowing the MAGA shirt would be visible. The real test was about to begin, not of political beliefs, but of professionalism, fair treatment, and the hospital's true culture. Little did anyone know, their responses in the next few hours would help shape the future of Metropolitan General. She picked up her purse, straightened her shirt, and walked toward the break room, already noticing the slight changes in expressions around her. The next few hours would reveal exactly what kind of hospital she had inherited, and exactly what changes might be needed. The hospital cafeteria buzzed with lunchtime activity as the new director walked in, her MAGA shirt now clearly visible without the blazer. She could feel the shift in atmosphere, subtle at first, like a change in air pressure before a storm. She grabbed a tray and joined the lunch line, acting as naturally as any other employee would. The young cashier's eyes flickered to her shirt, then quickly back to her face, professionally maintaining her smile. "That'll be $8.50, she said, her voice carrying just a hint of tension. The director handed over her card, noting how the cashier's colleague behind her had stopped mid-conversation to stare. Finding a seat near the middle of the cafeteria gave her the perfect vantage point to observe reactions. Some staff members pointedly looked away, while others huddled closer together, whispering behind raised hands. A table of nurses, who had been chatting animatedly, grew quiet as she passed by. She pulled out her phone and pretended to scroll through messages while actually watching the ripple effect of her presence spread through the room. Two doctors at a nearby table kept glancing her way, their faces a mix of disapproval and discomfort. An older maintenance worker shook his head slightly as he walked past. The food was barely touched on her plate when she noticed a group of administrative staff entering the cafeteria. Among them was a man in an expensive suit, his presence commanding attention. People seemed to straighten up automatically when he walked by, clearly someone in a position of authority. He stopped mid-stride when he spotted her shirt, his conversation with colleagues halting abruptly. The director could practically see the wheels turning in his head as he excused himself from his group and began walking toward her table. His face wore the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Excuse me," he said, placing both hands on the table and leaning forward slightly. "I couldn't help but notice your attire." His voice was low, presumably to avoid creating a scene, but several nearby tables had already gone quiet, straining to listen. The director looked up from her phone, maintaining a calm, questioning expression. "Is there a problem?" she asked innocently, her voice steady and professional. "Actually, yes," he replied, straightening up and adjusting his tie. "I'm Mr. Parker, assistant administrator, and we have certain standards of professional conduct here at Metropolitan General. Political statements of any kind can be disruptive to our healing environment." She noticed how he emphasized his title, wielding it like a shield. "I wasn't aware of any policy against political expression," she responded, keeping her tone curious rather than confrontational. "Could you point me to where that's documented?" Her question seemed to catch him off guard. He cleared his throat, glancing around at their growing audience. It's an understood practice," he stammered slightly. "We need to maintain a neutral environment for our patients and staff." Just then, a nurse walked past wearing a pin supporting a current social justice cause. The director nodded toward it, but before she could speak, Mr. Parker cut her off. "That's different," he said sharply, his professional veneer cracking slightly. "Some statements are more controversial than others." The cafeteria had grown unusually quiet now. Even those pretending not to listen were clearly hanging on every word. The director noticed a young orderly recording the interaction on his phone, trying to be discreet about it. "I see," she said simply, letting the double standard hang in the air. "And what happens if I choose to continue wearing this shirt?" Mr. Parker's face hardened. "Then we'll have to ask you to leave the premises. We can't have someone creating a hostile work environment." His voice carried a finality that suggested he was used to having the last word. The director looked around the cafeteria, mentally noting every face, every reaction. Some looked uncomfortable with Mr. Parker's approach, while others nodded in agreement. It was exactly the kind of revealing moment she had hoped to create, though the results were more dramatic than she'd expected. She gathered her things slowly, deliberately, aware that this moment would be remembered by everyone present. The real question was, how would they remember it when they learned the truth? The tension in the cafeteria could be cut with a knife as Mr. Parker stood there, arms crossed, waiting for her to leave. The director took her time gathering her belongings, watching as other employees tried to pretend they weren't staring. A young intern nearly dropped his tray, distracted by the unfolding scene. "I'd like to understand something," she said calmly, standing up but making no move to leave. "Are you saying that some political expressions are acceptable while others aren't?" Her voice carried clearly across the now silent cafeteria. Several phones were discreetly recording the interaction, their owners trying to look casual about it. Mr. Parker's face flushed slightly. "This isn't a debate," he said, his voice rising. I've made the decision. Security will escort you out if necessary. He pulled out his phone, thumb hovering over the keypad, making it clear this wasn't an idle threat. I'd like to see this policy in writing, she insisted, maintaining her composure. As an employee, I believe I have the right to review any policy being used to remove me from the workplace. Several heads nodded unconsciously around the room. It was a reasonable request. This seemed to irritate Mr. Parker even more. Listen, he said, stepping closer and lowering his voice to a harsh whisper. We both know what that shirt represents, and we both know it's not welcome here. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. The director noticed a group of nurses watching intently from their table. One of them wore a rainbow pin. Another had a Black Lives Matter bracelet. Neither seemed to realize they were proving her point about selective enforcement. What my shirt represents, she replied, her voice steady but firm, is my right to express my views, just like anyone else here. I've been nothing but professional. I haven't disrupted anything. The only disruption is coming from this confrontation that you initiated. Several people in the cafeteria shifted uncomfortably in their seats. An older doctor at a nearby table closed his eyes and shook his head, clearly disturbed by what he was witnessing. The young intern, who had almost dropped his tray earlier, was now openly filming the interaction. Mr. Parker's jaw clenched. He pressed a button on his phone, speaking sharply into it. Security to the cafeteria, please. His voice echoed slightly in the quiet room. And bring HR, he added, almost as an afterthought. The director remained calm, pulling out her own phone. I'd like to document this, she said, opening her camera app. Since there's apparently no written policy, I want to record that I'm being removed for wearing a political shirt, while others are allowed to wear different political messages. Put that phone away, Mr. Parker snapped, his professional demeanor cracking further. Recording is against hospital policy. Is that policy in writing? She asked innocently, which earned a few muffled chuckles from the onlookers. Mr. Parker's face turned an even deeper shade of red. 2 security guards appeared at the cafeteria entrance, followed by a nervous-looking woman in a business suit who must have been from HR. They approached the table quickly, trying to look authoritative despite the obvious discomfort on their faces. This employee is being removed for dress code violations, Mr. Parker announced loudly, apparently trying to regain control of the situation. Please escort her from the building. The HR representative stepped forward hesitantly. Sir, perhaps we should discuss this in private first. Our dress code policy doesn't specifically address. Just remove her. Mr. Parker cut her off sharply. The HR woman flinched slightly but didn't argue further. The director looked around the room one last time, taking in every face, every reaction. Some looked away in shame, others in agreement with Mr. Parker. A few seemed ready to speak up but remained silent, fear of retaliation evident in their expressions. As the security guards moved to escort her, she gathered her things with deliberate slowness. I'll leave, she said clearly, but this isn't over. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. And on Monday morning, everyone would understand exactly what she meant. The walk to the hospital exit felt like a parade in slow motion. The 2 security guards flanked the director as they made their way through the corridors, their footsteps echoing off the sterile walls. Mr. Parker followed behind, phone still in hand, as if ready to call for backup at any moment. Hospital staff stopped in their tracks as the group passed by. A patient being wheeled to radiology stared openly. The young man pushing her wheelchair whispered something to her, and she shook her head in disbelief. News traveled fast in hospitals, and whispers of what had happened in the cafeteria were already spreading like wildfire. The director held her head high, walking at a measured pace. She noticed how some employees quickly ducked into doorways or turned around when they saw the procession coming. Others watched with obvious curiosity, their eyes darting between her shirt and the security guards. A few even pulled out their phones to record the scene, though they quickly put them away when Mr. Parker glared in their direction. At the nurse's station, a group of staff members huddled together, watching the scene unfold. "This isn't right," one of them muttered, just loud enough to be heard. Mr. Parker shot them a sharp look, and they quickly dispersed, but their disapproval was clear. The elderly receptionist who had greeted the director that morning looked up in shock as they approached the lobby. "Oh my goodness," she gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "What's happening?" The concern in her voice was genuine, and it didn't go unnoticed how she glared at Mr. Parker rather than the person being escorted out. "Just a dress code violation being handled," Mr. Parker announced loudly, clearly trying to control the narrative. But his words seemed to have the opposite effect, causing more whispers and concerned looks among the gathering crowd. As they reached the automatic doors, the director stopped and turned to face Mr. Parker. The security guards tensed, unsure what to expect. "I'd like your full name and title for my records," she said calmly, pulling out a small notebook. Mr. Parker's face twitched. "You've been terminated. You have no right to—" "Actually," she interrupted smoothly, "as I wasn't given any written notice of termination or shown any policy I've violated, I'm still technically an employee. And as an employee, I have the right to know the name of the administrator taking action against me." The lobby had gone completely silent. Even the usual beeping of medical equipment seemed muted, as if the hospital itself was holding its breath. A young doctor stopped mid-conversation with a patient's family, all of them now watching the scene with rapt attention. Mr. Parker's professional mask slipped entirely. "I'm not playing games," he snapped. "Get out now, or I'll call the police." His voice echoed through the lobby, making several people flinch at its harshness. The director calmly wrote something in her notebook. "I'll note that you refused to provide your information," she said, "and that you threatened to call police over a shirt." She looked around at the gathered crowd, making eye contact with several witnesses. Would anyone be willing to provide a statement about what they've observed today? "That's enough," Mr. Parker nearly shouted. "Remove her immediately." The security guards, looking increasingly uncomfortable, gently urged her toward the door. As she stepped outside into the afternoon sun, the director turned one last time to the gathered crowd. "Remember what you saw today," she said clearly. "Remember how power was used. Remember who spoke up and who stayed silent." The doors slid closed behind her, leaving a lobby full of stunned faces and racing minds. Through the glass, she could see Mr. Parker already on his phone, likely calling his superiors to report what had happened. Little did he know, those superiors would be very interested indeed in hearing another version of today's events. She walked to her car with measured steps, acknowledging the waves and subtle nods from employees watching through windows. As she drove away, she couldn't help but smile slightly. Monday morning was going to be very interesting indeed. Instead of heading home, the director drove to a quiet coffee shop 2 blocks from the hospital. She ordered a large coffee and settled into a corner booth, pulling out her laptop and the small notebook where she'd been jotting down observations all day. The events needed to be documented while they were still fresh in her mind. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from concerned hospital board members. They'd given her permission to observe undercover, but none of them had expected things to unfold quite like this. She responded briefly, assuring them she was fine and that everything was going according to plan, more or less. Opening her laptop, she began typing, starting with the morning's arrival. The friendly greeting from the receptionist, the natural interactions she'd observed, the efficiency of the staff, all important details that showed the hospital's potential. Then she moved on to the cafeteria incident. As she typed, her coffee grew cold, forgotten in her focus. She described every detail, the exact words Mr. Parker had used, the reactions of various staff members, the visible double standard in handling political expression. She noted the names of employees wearing other political messages, the nurse with the social justice pin, the staff member with the equality bracelet. Her phone lit up with a new message. Someone had sent her a video. Then another. And another. Hospital employees were quietly sharing their recordings of both the cafeteria confrontation and the lobby exit. She downloaded each one, carefully labeling and saving them. These weren't just videos, they were evidence of systemic issues that needed addressing. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the coffee shop windows as she continued working. She pulled up the hospital's official policy handbook on her laptop, searching for anything about dress codes or political expression. As she'd suspected, there was nothing specific, just vague guidelines about professional appearance and maintaining a harmonious workplace environment. She began a new document listing all the policy gaps and inconsistencies she observed. The lack of clear dress code guidelines, the arbitrary enforcement of unwritten rules, the visible discomfort of HR when asked about specific policies, the fear she'd seen in employees' eyes when they wanted to speak up but couldn't. A group of nurses walked into the coffee shop, still in their scrubs, obviously just finishing their shifts. They didn't notice her in the corner booth, and their conversation carried clearly. "Can you believe what happened today?" One whispered loudly. "I've worked there 3 years, and I've never seen anything like it." "It was totally unfair," another added. "Remember when they let everyone wear campaign buttons last election?" Nobody said a word then. The director quietly pulled out her phone and started recording. This was exactly the kind of unsolicited testimony she needed. "Mr. Parker's always been like that," the third nurse said, shaking her head. "Rules for some, not for others. Remember when he made that young doctor take down her cultural heritage poster but left up all the Christmas decorations?" She added these new examples to her growing document. Each one painted a clearer picture of the cultural issues she'd need to address. The hospital wasn't just suffering from political bias. It had deeper problems with consistency, fairness, and professional conduct. As evening approached, she reviewed her documentation one final time. She had witness statements, videos, photos, policy contradictions, and personal observations. But more importantly, she had a clear view of both the hospital's problems and its potential. She packed up her laptop, leaving a generous tip for the barista who had kept her coffee filled without interrupting her work. Tomorrow, she would organize everything into a formal report. But Monday? Monday would be about action, about showing the entire staff what real leadership looked like. Driving home in the dying light, she felt satisfied. Today's events, though uncomfortable, had revealed exactly what she needed to see. Change was coming to Metropolitan General Hospital, and now she knew exactly where to start. Monday morning arrived with a crisp, bright energy. The director pulled into the hospital parking lot early, choosing a spot labeled Hospital Director. Today, she wore a perfectly tailored business suit, her director's badge gleaming on her lapel. Her MAGA shirt was carefully folded in her briefcase, a reminder of Friday's events. The same automatic doors that had expelled her 3 days ago now opened in welcome. The elderly receptionist from Friday looked up, recognition flooding her face, followed by confusion at the director's badge. Before she could say anything, a board member approached with a warm handshake. "Ready for your first official day?" he asked loudly enough for nearby staff to hear. The receptionist's jaw dropped, and a passing nurse nearly walked into a wall, doing a double take. News travels fast in hospitals, but this morning it moved at light speed. Within minutes, whispers were racing through every corridor. "The new director is here. Did you hear who it is? It's the woman from Friday, the one Parker kicked out." The director walked confidently through the halls, noting how different it felt from Friday. Now, instead of sideways glances at her shirt, she received startled looks of recognition followed by hasty greetings. A young orderly who had recorded Friday's incident dropped his clipboard when she passed. She took the elevator to the administrative floor, where the morning staff meeting would begin in 15 minutes. The same elevator where she had stood as an observer just 3 days ago now felt different. Everyone else pressed themselves against the walls, creating a respectful distance. The administrative floor was buzzing with nervous energy. As she approached the conference room, she could see Mr. Parker through the glass walls, arranging papers and looking pleased with himself. He was likely preparing to report how efficiently he had handled the political shirt incident. She paused at her new office first, a corner room with her name already on the door. Inside, she took a moment to place her things on the large desk and review her notes one final time. The documentation she'd gathered over the weekend was organized perfectly in a leather portfolio. At exactly 9:00 a.m., she walked into the conference room. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Coffee cups froze halfway to mouths. Mr. Parker, his back to the door, continued talking about quarterly objectives until he noticed nobody was listening to him. "Good morning, everyone," she said clearly, walking to the head of the table. Mr. Parker turned slowly, his face draining of color as recognition dawned. "I'm your new hospital director, and we have quite a lot to discuss this morning." The silence in the room was absolute. Someone's phone buzzed loudly, making several people jump. Mr. Parker's mouth opened and closed without producing sound, rather like a fish out of water. "Please, take your seats," she continued, her voice professional but firm. "Before we begin our regular morning meeting, I believe we need to address some concerning events from Friday." She opened her portfolio, pulling out printed screenshots from security cameras and witness statements. Mr. Parker finally found his voice. You? But," he stammered, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. "Mr. Parker," she said calmly, "please take your seat. We'll discuss your actions in detail shortly." She turned to address the whole room. What happened Friday wasn't just about a shirt. It was about leadership, fairness, and how we treat each other in this hospital. Through the glass walls, she could see staff members gathering in the hallway, trying to appear casual while straining to see what was happening. Word was spreading rapidly through the hospital that something big was about to go down in the morning meeting. She stood at the head of the table, command naturally radiating from her presence. This was the moment she'd been preparing for, not just since Friday, but throughout her entire career. It was time to show everyone at Metropolitan General what real leadership looked like. The conference room felt electric with tension as the director stood at the head of the table. Every eye was fixed on her, except for Mr. Parker's, which seemed determined to study the wood grain patterns on the conference table. "On Friday," she began, her voice clear and measured, "I conducted an undercover observation of our hospital's operations. What I witnessed was both encouraging and deeply concerning." She pressed a button on the remote, and the wall screen came to life with security camera footage from the cafeteria. "Our hospital's strength lies in its dedicated staff," she continued, nodding toward the HR representative who had tried to intervene on Friday. "I saw countless examples of excellent patient care and professional courtesy. However, I also witnessed something that requires immediate attention." The screen now showed Mr. Parker's confrontation with her in the cafeteria. The crystal-clear footage captured every word, every gesture. Several administrators shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes, as if hoping the scene would disappear. "Mr. Parker," she said, turning to face him directly. He finally looked up, his face a mask of barely controlled panic. "Would you care to explain why you felt it necessary to remove an employee for wearing a political shirt while others openly displayed different political messages?" The room held its breath. Through the glass walls, the crowd in the hallway had grown larger. Word had spread throughout the hospital, and staff members were finding creative reasons to pass by the conference room. I was maintaining order," he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "That particular shirt, it could have caused disruption. The only disruption," she interrupted firmly, "was caused by your actions." She clicked to the next slide, showing statistics from Friday's incident. Productivity dropped 23% after the confrontation. 3 patients filed complaints about the commotion in the lobby. 5 staff members submitted formal complaints about witnessing workplace discrimination. Mr. Parker's tie suddenly seemed too tight as he tugged at it nervously. The other administrators watched in stunned silence as their colleagues' authority crumbled before their eyes. However, the director continued, her tone softening slightly. This meeting isn't about punishment. It's about growth and change. She switched off the screen and placed both hands on the table, leaning forward. This hospital needs clear, consistent policies that are fairly applied to everyone. We need leadership that unites rather than divides. The HR representative tentatively raised her hand. When the director nodded, she spoke up. I've been saying for months that we need written policies about political expression in the workplace. But I was always told it wasn't necessary. It is necessary, the director confirmed, and you'll be leading the committee to develop those policies. The HR representative sat up straighter, a small smile playing at her lips. But your shirt. Mr. Parker made one last attempt to defend himself. You were testing us, trying to provoke a reaction. No, she replied calmly. I was observing how this hospital handles differences of opinion. Whether someone wears an MAGA shirt or a social justice pin, they deserve to be treated with the same respect as long as they perform their duties professionally. She pulled out a thick folder and placed it on the table. This contains my full report, including recommendations for policy changes, training programs, and, she paused significantly, personnel adjustments. Mr. Parker seemed to shrink in his chair. The other administrators were already distancing themselves from him, subtly sliding their chairs away. We have two choices, the director announced to the room. We can let Friday's events divide us further, or we can use them as a catalyst for positive change. I'm choosing the latter. She opened the folder and began distributing documents. Now let's talk about how we're going to build a better hospital together. Through the glass walls, staff members who had gathered to watch broke into spontaneous applause. Inside the conference room, even those who might have disagreed with her politics couldn't help but respect her leadership. This was clearly the beginning of a new era at Metropolitan General. The afternoon sun streamed through the hospital windows as the director walked the halls, visiting each department. The morning's meeting had ended with clear action items and a new sense of purpose. Now it was time to connect with the staff directly. Word of what happened in the conference room had spread like wildfire. As she entered the emergency department, conversations hushed briefly before erupting into genuine greetings. A young nurse who had witnessed Friday's cafeteria incident rushed up to her. I just wanted to say, the nurse said, nervously fidgeting with her badge, I'm sorry I didn't speak up on Friday. I knew it wasn't right, but I was scared. The director smiled warmly. That's exactly what we're going to change. Fear has no place in a well-run hospital. Several nearby staff members nodded in agreement, some even breaking into spontaneous applause. In the radiology department, she found the technician who had recorded part of Friday's confrontation. He started to apologize for filming, but she cut him off gently. Actually, you did exactly the right thing. Documentation helps us improve. The cafeteria, scene of Friday's dramatic events, fell silent as she entered. But this silence felt different from Friday's tense atmosphere. She walked to the center of the room and cleared her throat. I'd like to buy lunch for everyone today, she announced. And while you eat, I want to hear your ideas for making this hospital better. The silence broke into excited chatter as people began forming lines, not just for food, but to share their thoughts. Staff members who had been quiet for years suddenly found their voices. A veteran nurse suggested improvements to the break room schedule. A maintenance worker proposed a more efficient system for handling repair requests. Even the cafeteria staff joined in, offering ideas about making the lunch hour run more smoothly. By late afternoon, she was back in her office, reviewing the day's events with the HR representative who had tried to intervene on Friday. Mr. Parker has submitted his resignation, the HR rep said, placing the letter on the desk. Accept it, the director replied, but make sure his exit interview includes feedback about today's policy changes. This is about learning, not punishment. The HR rep smiled, clearly appreciating this approach to leadership. A knock at the door interrupted them. The elderly receptionist from the front desk stood there, holding a small package. The staff, "Well, we wanted to give you something," she said shyly. Inside the package was a new nameplate for the director's desk, but underneath her name and title, there was an engraving. "Leadership is about lifting people up, not putting them down." "We took up a collection at lunch," the receptionist explained. "Everyone wanted to contribute, even people who might not agree with your politics. Because you showed us it's not about that. It's about respect." The director placed the nameplate proudly on her desk, touching the engraving gently. Through her office window, she could see the hospital parking lot, where Mr. Parker was leaving for the last time, a box of personal items in his arms. But instead of feeling triumphant, she felt hopeful about the changes to come. Her phone buzzed with a message from the board. The local news had gotten wind of Friday's events and wanted to do a story. She declined the interview request. This wasn't about publicity or proving a point. It was about building a better workplace for everyone. As the day wound down, she stood at her window, watching the shift change. Day staff heading home crossed paths with night staff arriving, and she noticed something remarkable. They were talking, laughing, sharing stories about the day's events. The invisible barriers that had divided departments and shifts were already starting to crumble. On her desk, next to the new nameplate, lay her MAGA shirt, neatly folded. She picked it up and placed it in her briefcase. It had served its purpose, not as a political statement, but as a catalyst for needed change. Metropolitan General was on its way to becoming something better, something stronger, something more united. 6 months had passed since that memorable Monday morning. The director stood in the hospital's newly renovated main lobby, watching the morning shift arrive. The changes were visible everywhere, from the updated policy handbook in everyone's hands to the smiles on people's faces. The most striking change wasn't physical, it was in the atmosphere. Staff members from different departments chatted easily as they walked in together. A doctor held the door for a maintenance worker, and they discussed last night's baseball game like old friends. The rigid hierarchies of the past had melted away. Near the reception desk, a bulletin board displayed the hospital's new mission statement: "Excellence in care, unity in purpose." Below it hung photos from recent hospital events: the summer picnic where surgeons had served food alongside cafeteria staff, the charity run where administrators and nurses had raised money together for the children's ward. The elderly receptionist, still at her familiar post, waved over a young nurse who was wearing a conservative political button. Next to her stood another nurse with a liberal cause pin on her lanyard. They were laughing together, planning the upcoming Staff Appreciation Day. "Can you believe how things have changed?" the receptionist asked as the director approached. "Last week, we had that heated debate in the break room about healthcare policy. But you know what? Everyone stayed professional, listened to each other, and then went right back to working together. That never would have happened before." The director smiled, remembering how that same break room had once been the scene of her confrontation with Mr. Parker. Now it was a place where staff members felt safe expressing their views while respecting others' right to disagree. The morning's management meeting looked nothing like that tense gathering 6 months ago. The conference room was filled with voices from all levels of hospital operations. Nurses sharing patient care insights, maintenance staff suggesting efficiency improvements, administrators actually listening to frontline workers. "Our patient satisfaction scores are up 45% from last year," the new assistant administrator reported. She had been promoted from HR after showing remarkable leadership in developing the new workplace policies. Staff turnover is down by 60%, and we're now rated as one of the top hospitals to work for in the state. But the numbers didn't tell the whole story. The real success was in the small moments, like when a veteran nurse mentored a new hire wearing a political button different from her own, or when the cafeteria staff organized a celebration for a custodian's retirement that the entire hospital attended. After the meeting, the director walked the hospital corridors, as she did every morning. In the pediatric ward, she passed the wall where staff members now freely displayed their cultural heritage photos alongside holiday decorations of all kinds. Every image represented a piece of someone's identity, all coexisting respectfully. In her office, she opened her desk drawer and looked at the folded MAGA shirt that had started it all. It had never been about the shirt. It had been about creating a workplace where everyone felt valued, heard, and respected, regardless of their views. The intercom crackled with a code announcement, and she watched through her window as staff members rushed to respond. There was no hesitation, no checking who believed what before working together. They moved as one team, focused entirely on patient care. On her desk, next to the nameplate the staff had given her, sat an industry magazine. Metropolitan General was featured on the cover, celebrated for its innovative approach to workplace culture. The article highlighted how a small incident had transformed into a model for positive change. As the day shift settled into their routines, the director reflected on how far they'd come. The hospital hadn't just changed its policies, it had changed its heart. They had proven that people with different beliefs could work together, respect each other, and even find common ground. The MAGA shirt incident had become a teaching moment in new employee orientation, not as a story of conflict, but as an example of how challenging moments could lead to positive transformation. Metropolitan General had become more than just a hospital. It was now a community where differences were respected and unity was found in service to others.